Satan, the adversary of our souls. He is said to have deceived humanity, caused the fall of the first couple, challenged Job's faithfulness, tempted Jesus himself, and at the end of time would be associated with the persecution of God's followers and a battle against heaven itself. But there is a detail that makes Satan even more disturbing. Not all of this is written in the way popular culture usually tells the story. In the Bible, Satan is presented as the great adversary, the accuser, and the tempter, but his story was expanded over centuries through Jewish and Christian interpretations and through texts that remained outside the biblical canon. In the book of Genesis, for example, we encounter the serpent who convinces Eve to disobey God's command. But the original text does not explicitly call this serpent Satan. It is only later, especially in Revelation, that the identification between the ancient serpent and the devil appears. In Job, Satan takes on another frightening role. He questions the integrity of a man considered righteous and puts his faithfulness to the test, resulting in a sequence of devastating events in Job's life. Then, in the New Testament, he appears before Jesus in the wilderness, offering power, authority, and glory in exchange for worship. And in Revelation, his image becomes even more monstrous. He is described as the great dragon, the ancient serpent, the devil, and Satan, the one who deceives the world. Outside the Bible, the figure takes on even greater dimensions. Texts such as 1 Enoch, which is not part of the Bible in most Christian traditions, present rebellious heavenly beings known as the Watchers, associated with the corruption of humanity. Later traditions developed an increasingly detailed narrative about the heavenly rebellion and Satan's fall. This is where many of the images we know today come from: the angel who rebels against God, the leader of demonic forces, and the great enemy of humanity. However, there is a fundamental difference between tradition and scripture. The Bible does not present Satan as a rival god, capable of confronting God on equal terms. On the contrary, he appears as a limited creature subject to divine authority. And perhaps that is what makes the entire story most frightening, because according to Revelation, his activity would not simply end with his defeat. The book describes his final confrontation, his expulsion, and afterward, his condemnation. In other words, the story of Satan in the biblical narrative is not only about the evil he commits, it is also about a creature who knows that his time is limited. And it is precisely this idea that prepares the way for us to meet the other names associated with the demonic world, because Satan may be the most famous of them, but he is definitely not the only dark figure that appears in these ancient traditions.
Beelzebub, the prince of demons. If Satan is presented as the great adversary, there is another name that appears in the Gospels in an extremely provocative way: Beelzebub. And the strangest part is that this name emerges precisely in an accusation made against Jesus. According to the Gospel of Matthew, after Jesus casts out a demon from a man who could neither speak nor see, the crowd begins questioning where this power truly comes from. The Pharisees then make a shocking accusation. They say that Jesus casts out demons by the power of Beelzebub, who is called the Prince of Demons. In other words, within that accusation, Beelzebub would not simply be another evil spirit. He appears associated with a position of authority over other demons. But where did this name come from? The origin is even more curious. Beelzebub is related to an ancient Semitic name, often associated with Baal-zebub, a deity mentioned in the Old Testament and connected to the city of Ekron. Over time, the name underwent linguistic transformations and Jewish interpretations, acquiring an increasingly negative association. In the New Testament, it is already directly connected to the demonic world. And Jesus responds to the accusation with a phrase that became one of the best-known statements in the Gospels. If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. Jesus' reasoning was simple. If Satan's kingdom were fighting against itself, that kingdom could not stand. But here a fascinating question emerges. Would Beelzebub and Satan be exactly the same entity? The Bible does not provide a complete explanation of this. In some later Christian contexts, the two names came to be treated as practically equivalent. In others, Beelzebub came to be interpreted as a high-ranking demon subordinate to Satan. And it was mainly through later texts and traditions that his image acquired increasingly monstrous characteristics. Some medieval works even placed him among the principal rulers of hell, associated with gluttony, corruption, and decay. But these classifications are not organized this way in the Bible. What the biblical text actually gives us is something simpler and at the same time disturbing. Beelzebub is called the prince of demons. And if this expression is taken literally, it means that we are dealing with a figure associated with the leadership of demonic forces. But there is an even stranger character in this story, a being whose very name means destruction, who appears in Revelation accompanied by a multitude of terrifying creatures emerging from the abyss. And when this next name appears, the story stops looking like merely a spiritual conflict and begins to take on apocalyptic proportions.
Abaddon, the angel of the abyss. Now imagine opening the final book of the Bible and encountering a creature that does not appear simply as an ordinary demon, but as the angel of the abyss. His name is Abaddon, and the most disturbing part is that in the Greek text of Revelation, he is also given another name, Apollyon, a word associated with the idea of destruction. The scene takes place during one of the most frightening passages in Revelation. A star falls from heaven and is given the key to the shaft of the abyss. When this shaft is opened, an enormous cloud of smoke rises from it, and out of it emerge creatures resembling locusts, but completely different from the insects we know. They are given power to torment human beings for 5 months, and their description seems to have come straight out of a nightmare. They have something resembling crowns, human faces, hair like women's hair, teeth like lions, and breastplates of iron. But then the question arises, who is commanding all of this? This is when the text introduces Abaddon, also identified as Apollyon, the angel responsible for the abyss. And there is something important here. Unlike Satan, who appears repeatedly throughout different biblical books, Abaddon appears in a very specific way in Revelation. Because of this, there is not enough biblical description to claim that he is simply another name for Satan. In fact, the text presents him as having his own identity. The Hebrew name Abaddon is associated with destruction or a place of destruction, while Apollyon in Greek means something like destroyer. Centuries later, Christian traditions and literary works began transforming Abaddon into a much more elaborate figure, sometimes treating him as a great demon or commander of the forces of hell. But the Bible is more specific, and precisely because of that, more mysterious. It calls him the angel of the abyss, and this creates an impressive image. While Satan is presented as the great adversary, and Beelzebub is called the prince of demons, Abaddon appears associated with a place that the biblical narrative itself presents as a realm of destruction and confinement. And perhaps the most frightening detail is that Abaddon does not need to be described personally attacking anyone. His presence is connected to the opening of the abyss and the release of a force that transforms the earth into a scene of torment. But there is another detail. The next character on our list is completely different, because when a demonic entity is asked, "What is your name?" the answer is not the name of an individual. The answer is a word that means an uncountable number of beings, and that answer became known by one of the most terrifying names ever recorded in the Gospels: Legion.
Imagine encountering a man living among tombs, completely out of control, breaking chains and terrifying anyone who tried to approach him. He was not described simply as an aggressive person. According to the Gospels, his strength was so extraordinary that no one could control him. And then Jesus appears. The man runs toward him, but something very strange happens. A voice begins speaking through that man's body. Jesus asks, "What is your name?" And the answer is one of the most disturbing statements in the entire New Testament. "My name is Legion, for we are many." In Mark 5, this entity, or group of entities, is presented as a multitude of evil spirits that had taken control of the man. The name Legion probably refers to the Roman military legions, enormous units composed of many soldiers, and precisely because of this, the answer conveys an idea of overwhelming numbers and strength. But there is an important difference between this story and many popular representations of possession. The text does not say that Legion is necessarily a specific demon with that individual name. On the contrary, the entity itself declares that we are many. In Luke, the same story also appears, and the spirits demonstrate that they know exactly who Jesus is. They beg not to be sent into the abyss and ask for permission to enter a large herd of pigs that was nearby. Jesus allows it. Then the spirits leave the man, enter the pigs, and the entire herd violently rushes toward a cliff, falling into the lake. The man who had previously lived isolated and controlled by the spirits is later found sitting, dressed, and in his right mind. And here is one of the most interesting details of the narrative. Legion recognizes an authority greater than its own. They do not confront Jesus as if they were facing an equal opponent. They beg, negotiate, and ask for permission. This reinforces a recurring characteristic of the Gospels. The demons possess power within the narrative, but that power is not presented as unlimited. And there is another question that has crossed centuries of interpretation. How many spirits were actually inside that man? The Bible does not provide a number. The term legion mainly communicates the idea of an enormous quantity, and not necessarily the thousands of soldiers that a Roman legion could represent. Therefore, saying that there were exactly 6,000 or more would go beyond what the text allows. Even so, the image remains terrifying, a single man presented as being controlled by a multitude of spirits. But now we reach the final name on our list, and unlike Satan, Beelzebub, Abaddon, and Legion, he does not represent a specific demonic character. We are talking about an entire category of beings that appears repeatedly in the Gospels, the so-called unclean spirits. And it is precisely here that we discover how the Bible describes the invisible army that appears behind so many stories of possession. They have no single name, no defined appearance, and most of the time, we do not even know how many of them there are. And yet, the so-called unclean spirits appear repeatedly throughout the Gospels, entering people, causing destructive behavior, and being cast out by Jesus and his disciples. And perhaps it is precisely this lack of identity that makes these figures so intriguing. Unlike Satan or Abaddon, the Gospels present unclean spirits as a category of evil entities. In several passages, they are simply called demons. In Mark, for example, Jesus encounters people tormented by unclean spirits and casts them out. In another episode, a spirit is described as being responsible for afflicting a child with seizures, although the text also makes it clear that not every illness mentioned in the Gospels is attributed to demons. There is also an extremely curious passage in Matthew 12 in which Jesus explains what happens to an unclean spirit after it has been cast out. It passes through arid places looking for rest, but finds none. So it decides to return to the person from whom it came. When it returns and finds the house empty,
It seeks out other spirits even more wicked than itself and comes back accompanied by them. The result, according to the narrative, would be a condition worse than the first. This passage introduces a frightening idea. An evil spirit might not act alone. The Bible also describes unclean spirits immediately recognizing Jesus, shouting his name, and declaring that they know who he is. In Mark 1, one of them even says that it knows who Jesus is, the Holy One of God. And once again, a pattern appears. These beings demonstrate knowledge of Jesus' identity, but they do not possess authority equal to his. They obey when they are cast out. This is important because despite centuries of stories about demonic hierarchies, the Bible does not present an organized list stating which demon is stronger, which one rules over a particular region, or which one controls a specific sin. Many of these classifications emerged later through religious traditions, grimoires, medieval literature, and works of demonology. In the biblical text, the picture is much more mysterious. There is Satan, demons, unclean spirits, the angel of the abyss, and other figures associated with evil, but their powers and positions are not always explained. And this leads us to an important conclusion about the 5 names we have just encountered. Satan is the great adversary. Beelzebub is called the prince of demons. Abaddon appears as the angel of the abyss. Legion represents a multitude of spirits, and unclean spirits appear as a recurring category of evil entities. But however, if you thought this was the whole story, there is a second, much darker layer, because when we leave the Bible and enter ancient texts such as 1 Enoch, we encounter names, fallen angels, and supernatural beings that gave rise to some of the most frightening stories in Jewish Christian tradition, and that is where the list of demonic entities becomes much larger.